Joining me now is our political panel, former Liberal advisor David Gaza and former Labor advisor Eamonn Fitzpatrick. Gentlemen, great to see you both. This afternoon, Nick McKim and the Greens are going to introduce a motion in the Senate, Eamonn, saying that we're calling on the Senate to oppose Israel's invasion of Gaza. I spoke to Don Farrell, the Trade Minister, before. He was critical of the Greens for their stance, and clearly there will be no support from the government on that.
The problem with the Greens, unfortunately, is they're not shy of playing politics harder than anybody, despite everything they say. Let's not forget, they make housing their number one issue, and what happened when we're looking at that housing bill just in September. They pulled out of nowhere. What do? They disrupted the whole joint with a motion about the 50th anniversary of the revolution in Chile. So, you know, let's just have a think about who they are and what they actually do. This is simply designed to grab the headlines. Adam Bandt knows that. You know, everyone else in that parliament is trying to be constructive. This is a very, very difficult situation for so many people, not just in Australia, obviously, but over in that part of the world. And it's got reverberations everywhere. And a parliament and people in the parliament have a responsibility to act with, you know, in moderation and basically try and keep everything in line and demonstrate a bit of community leadership. You know, doing something like this where it's the equivalent of just trying to rile everybody up for the sake of a headline is not conducive to that at all.
But when you talk about the Greens being political, well, you look at this scenario today, it's hard to imagine members of the Jewish Australian community ever voting for the Greens again, given some of the behaviour we've seen off the back of the Hamas atrocity.
When you're quoting Islamic Jihad as your source point to say the Israelis bombed the hospital, you know you're in deep strife, in my view. And Adam Bandt, in appealing to the 10% of voters that vote Green, is going to veer into a territory where, if he's doing this politically, as Eamonn says, is going to find himself the subject of the major parties fighting over who's going to put the Greens last. I mean, this is the territory. You've got kids' heads being hacked off. You've got kids at a dance party being killed. And given Israel is the only flourishing democracy in the region, I can almost guarantee many of those kids probably would vote the Israeli equivalent of the Greens and of the Australia or the Israel Labor Party, and they're being wantonly killed for no provocation. And the extreme left side of politics is going back to this sort of we support and solidarity for Palestine. I mean, they are cruising for a bruising.
We've seen a real divide between the Teal independents. I've got Zoe Daniel joining me in about 15 minutes, but she disagreed with Kylie Tink and Sophie Scomps, two Teal independents that voted in support of a Greens amendment earlier in the week in the lower house. What did you make of that, with a couple of Teal independents, like Allegra Spender as well, distancing herself from that position?
Yeah, well, they're finally going to get dragged out of the comfort zone. They've had a pretty good position up until now, I think, given their entry into the parliament. But you know what? We are at a pretty difficult time. They're going to be called on to make difficult calls for some of them, and they're going to have to go with their electorates and the feeling in their electorates. And some of them are going to have to reflect what the reality is. They can't just hope to play games here in the sort of safety of this parliament alone. And I think that is what we're seeing right now. You know, we are going to see splits, and we are going to see...
There are the faces of the Teals that oppose the Greens motion, and as I say, Zoe Daniel very much of that position, wanting to say that she disagreed with the stance taken by the two fellow Teals.
Yeah, well, you know, they need to be true to their word, and if they're going to be independents, they're going to have to speak up at some point, you know, so that doesn't surprise me.
David, your thoughts on that?
High Jewish constituency in their seats, particularly Zoe and Allegra. Good on them. Good on them for standing up for that. But the others have got to start reflecting on the standards and principles by which we govern ourselves. And they don't go to listening to Islamic Jihad and, you know, moving outside of their zone and wantonly killing and butchering innocent people.
The voice to Parliament, the referendum went down emphatically. Has the debate politically moved on, while obviously there's a lot of trauma right now in certain parts of the Indigenous communities, and for those that advocated for it so strongly, politically, and the pragmatism of just where the government goes, they haven't asked a question on it the last 48 hours.
Yeah, and look, I think it is actually important, regardless of how anybody voted, to actually just reflect and to acknowledge there are a lot of Indigenous Australians who put a lot into that campaign, and they are obviously hurting, and we have to respect what they talked about in terms of not wanting to say anything for next week or so. But the political challenge, it is now back on the government to continue to chart that path forward, and it is going to be back on issues around the economy. I mean, there was a lot of activity up until last Saturday that wasn't related to the referendum. I mean, everything from the budget surplus to the employment white paper to dealing with housing to all those sorts of things. This is a government that has routinely focused on the economy, and it will be back to that pretty quickly.
Well, it's the economy, and also I would say security, and international security is a big part of that. The Prime Minister's off to Washington to meet with the US President on Sunday, so that will certainly shift things in that direction.
Yeah, and there'll be bipartisanship on security. And to Albanese's credit, he has taken exactly the same line the previous government did when it comes to China and national security more generally. If you listen to caucus, they are cranky that so much political capital has been spent on The Voice. They want the government back and focused on the issues that are important to constituents, and that is cost of living. And there's now bills before the House on IR, which arguably drive up the cost of living, and energy, which drive up the cost of living. So it is going to be very, very difficult for the government to refocus on that. Lastly, I would say Matt Thistlethwaite, who is the Assistant Minister for the Republic, I would go to the Prime Minister's office this afternoon and say, here's my commission back, give me another job, because there is going to be no referendum on the Republic in the next generation, I would say, after what's happened over the last weekend on referenda.
And if there is, we've learnt another bit of history that you've got to learn from it, and that is without bipartisanship, these things go down.
Very, very difficult.
Yep.
And people want their leaders focused on issues that matter to them right now.
So it's back to the economy, back to cost of living. That's the main game, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But that's been the theme right throughout. I mean, you look at every policy priority has basically come down to that again, whether it is talking about renewables, jobs, all those sorts of things. 100%. Trade is also a big one, obviously, not just the US. There's that China trip coming up. Don Farrell talked about the work that's happened there, and that will be good for Australia.
And those wine tariffs could be coming off within weeks. Eamonn Fitzpatrick, David Gaza, gentlemen, great to see you both.